Hi, I'm Mr. Loomis. Welcome back for our next unit, which is all about the social revolution. This is another unit that's long. It's going to span about 4 decades, from the 1950s through the 1980s. And this time, we're going to be talking a lot about the way regular Americans were living. So we'll be talking a lot less about specific leaders or events, and a lot more about people like you and me. We're grouping these topics together because America made an interesting journey during this time from being very conservative to being super liberal and eager for change, and then back again to being conservative and disliking change. To get started, we're going to learn about life in the 1950s, a time when Americans mostly all wanted to be the same. You might already know a bit about this time from movies like Grease and pictures of poodle skirts. Let's take a look at today's topics. We'll talk about what made the 1950s great, including the economy, politics, population, and religion. We'll spend some time on the idea of the perfect family of the 1950s and how television, which was new, promoted that idea. We'll introduce rock and roll, which was also new in the 1950s. And we'll finish by learning about some of the people who didn't enjoy the 50s or rejected the ideas about how people were supposed to live and tried to make their own way. Let's get started with money, which there was plenty of in the 1950s. After World War II, life for many Americans was predictable and good. Workers earned more money, bought bigger houses, sent their kids to better schools, had more cars, bought home appliances like vacuum cleaners and washing machines that made life easier. A lot of things we use today were invented in the 1950s. The economy did well and grew every year between 1945, when World War II ended, and 1970. This growth was partly because of government spending during the Cold War, but it was also because people were buying new homes. Many workers' incomes doubled in a generation. This led to a lot of people moving up into the middle class. People who worked on assembly lines or unionized factory jobs were paid well and were able to move up the ladder to the middle class. By the end of the 1950s, almost all American families had a TV, most had a car, and many owned their own homes. Blue-collar workers who did manual labor were buying more luxury items than ever before. The economy during the 1950s was very different from the economy during the Great Depression of the 1930s and early 1940s. Kids who grew up before World War II and saw their parents struggle found themselves surrounded by modern appliances and living in new homes as young adults. Their lives were very different from the generation before them. As the economy grew, big businesses became more common and smaller businesses began to fail. For example, small newspapers were bought out by larger ones. Fewer people rode trains as more people bought cars, and the interstate highway system was built. Some smaller car companies like Nash, Studebaker, and Packard couldn't compete with the big companies like General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. Technology also changed farming. Fertilizers became less expensive because factories that had made the chemicals for bombs during World War II could make those chemicals and use them for fertilizer instead. Tractors replaced horses and mules, and machines that picked cotton were invented. However, these changes also led to fewer but larger farms. Some farmers sold their land to bigger farmers or moved to towns to find work. The 1950s were a time when healthcare in America really changed. The projects of the late 1800s, such as sewer systems that focused on large groups of people, gave way to a focus on individual health. New discoveries and new ways of paying for medical care were the drivers of this change. One of the most famous medical achievements of the 1950s was the discovery of the polio vaccine. Polio is a disease that causes paralysis and usually affects children or teenagers. Dr. Jonas Salk and his team spent 7 years researching a vaccine for polio before announcing their success in 1955. The polio vaccine has since saved countless lives and has been an essential tool in stopping the spread of the disease. In addition to the polio vaccine, there were significant surgical advancements during the 1950s. The first open heart operation was performed in 1953, and immunosuppressant drugs made organ transplants possible. These medical advancements have allowed doctors to perform life-saving surgeries that were once impossible. The pharmaceutical industry also saw significant changes during this era. Large drug companies began making medication and sending it to pharmacies around the country. This replaced the older system when pharmacists in each town made their own medications to sell. The result was that Americans everywhere could buy safer, more effective medication. The 1950s also saw changes in healthcare payment. The government had limited how much companies could pay workers during World War II, so businesses had offered incentives such as health insurance to get people to work for them. As a result, most Americans now receive healthcare insurance from their employers. This shift in healthcare payment has allowed more people to access healthcare, improving their overall health and quality of life. I promised we weren't going to talk much about politics, so let's just take a moment to mention the president during the 1950s. Dwight Eisenhower was the president of the United States for most of the decade. He was a war hero and tried to find a balance between the two major political parties. Unlike the Democrats before him, Eisenhower didn't want to spend more money on new programs. He also didn't want to cut popular programs like Social Security. This strategy was called modern republicanism. It stopped Democrats from making the New Deal bigger and stopped conservative Republicans from changing Social Security. Because of this, nothing very interesting happened politically during the decade. Eisenhower was very popular, and it seems that after World War II and the Korean War, most Americans just wanted politics to be peaceful and quiet. Sometimes laws get passed that have a huge impact on the life of regular people. The GI Bill was one of those laws. So let's take a moment to understand just what it did. During World War II, many Americans had joined the military and fought for their country. After the war ended, the government wanted to help these soldiers get back to normal life and be successful. The result was the GI Bill. The law gave tax money to veterans for low-cost mortgages to buy homes, low-interest loans to start businesses, cash for schools, and money for 1 year while they looked for jobs. Any veteran who had served for at least 90 days could apply for these benefits. The GI Bill helped many veterans go to college or learn a trade. More than half of all the World War II veterans who used the benefits went to college. And by 1947, nearly half of all college students were veterans. In total, about 2 million veterans used the benefits to enroll in college or universities, and 5.6 million used the benefits for job training programs. This was a huge change for America. Before the GI Bill, few Americans went to college. The GI Bill also helped many veterans become middle class. With low interest loans, they could start businesses and buy homes. However, the law was not designed to help everyone equally. African Americans and other minorities often didn't get help because of discrimination. Even though the law said any veteran could apply for the benefits, local governments were in charge of giving out the money, and discrimination was common, especially in the South. As a result, many African Americans were left out and didn't benefit from the GI Bill. Most of you have heard of the boomers, or perhaps the phrase, "okay, boomer." Let's take a minute to learn about where they came from. In the years after World War II, there was a huge increase in the number of babies born in the United States. A New York Post columnist named Sylvia Porter called it the baby boom in 1951. The people born during this time are now called the baby boomers. There were several reasons for the baby boom. During the Great Depression, many people couldn't afford to have children. After the war, they wanted to make up for lost time. Also, many veterans returned from the war, got married, and started their families. Marriage rates went up, and people started getting married at younger ages. Women were often expected to get married right after high school, and for many women, going to college was seen as a way to find a husband, not get an education. And it wasn't just about getting married or having babies. Those growing families needed places to live. During the Great Depression and World War II, most Americans gave up on achieving the American dream or having a nice family and owning their own home. But in the 1950s, millions of Americans were able to make this dream a reality. One reason for this was the GI Bill, and it led to more houses being built in new neighborhoods called suburbs outside the big cities. Suburbs grew for multiple reasons. First, there were a lot of new families who needed homes, but also some people were afraid of living in the cities where they might be neighbors with people of other races, or they just wanted to get away from the crowds. A man named William Levitt built a huge suburb on Long Island, New York, using a technique he learned from building houses for the military during the war. Levitt identified 27 different steps to build a house. So he had 27 different teams of workers, and they built homes in a production line. Each house had 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and no basement. The kitchens were in the back of the houses, so mothers could keep an eye on their children in the backyard. Within 1 year, Levitt was building 36 houses per day. His assembly line approach made the houses affordable. Eventually, he built 7 suburbs around the country like this, and 3 of them are still called Levittown. Other people copied Levitt's idea of building houses quickly. In California, developers built so many houses that they could finish 60 a day on average, and sometimes 110 in one day. People liked living in suburbs because they could own their own land and have a backyard with grass. With all the new houses being built, Americans had a higher standard of living than ever before. For the first time in America, shopping malls and fast food restaurants opened so people wouldn't have to go into the city to shop or eat out. As more Americans were raising families and settling into the suburbs, there was also an increase in the number of people who joined churches, especially Protestant ones. Between 1950 and 1960, the number of Americans who were members of a church went up from 49% to 69%. Some religious leaders became famous, and their messages became popular in movies and television shows. In the southern United States, evangelical leaders like Billy Graham became popular. He was one of the first religious leaders to preach on TV, and he became friends with multiple presidents. Religion became important in politics too. In 1954, Congress added the words "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance to show that the United States was religious and not like communist governments that discouraged religion. President Eisenhower got baptized to show he was religious, even though he'd not been a church member before. Ever since the 1950s, the religious beliefs of people who want to be president are usually an important part of their campaigns. Although religion was becoming a bigger part of everyday life, the Supreme Court made sure that religion and government stayed separate. In the Emerson v. Board of Education case, they said that the government could not use tax money to pay for religious schools. They also said in the Engel versus Vitale case that school leaders could not lead prayers in public schools. Music and television were both really important in the 1950s. Most of us can't imagine a house without a television, and it was during the 1950s that televisions became common. At the end of World War II, only a few wealthy Americans had TVs, and they were thought of as expensive toys. But just 10 years later, nearly 2/3 of American homes had a television, and TV Guide was the best-selling magazine of the decade. Television brought people from over the country together. People from different social classes and political beliefs all watched the same shows, and this created a shared national culture in an even more powerful way than radio had decades before. However, this culture was primarily focused on white Christian families, with shows like Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best, presenting an idealized version of what a family should be like. Sitcoms or situational comedies were especially popular. I Love Lucy was one example from the decade. Westerns were also very popular, with shows like Gunsmoke running for 20 years. Westerns reinforced the idea that everything was okay in America, with good guys who always beat bad guys in the end. Television also had a big impact on politics. Harry Truman was the first president to appear on TV. Political advisors quickly realized the power of TV, with Dwight Eisenhower's campaign generating sound bites instead of showing full speeches. Television continues to have a huge influence on politics. In 2016, Donald Trump, a real estate broker and a reality TV star, won the presidency, partly due to his masterful use of television. Rock and roll was born in the 1950s. It was based on African American music styles like jazz, blues, and gospel that had become popular in the 1920s as African Americans moved to the cities of the North. In the 1950s, white teenagers started to listen to a style called rhythm and blues, or R&B. However, because of segregation and racism, the greatest R&B artists, who were all African American, couldn't get much airplay on the radio. A disc jockey named Alan Freed started an R&B show on a Cleveland radio station, called it Rock and Roll, and his audiences grew. Some white artists tried to cover R&B songs, but they were not as good as the originals. Record producers saw their chance to cash in on the new style and started looking for a white artist who could capture the African American sound. A record producer from Memphis named Sam Phillips found the answer in Elvis Presley. With his deep Southern sound, pouty lips, and gyrating hips, Elvis made R&B his own. Elvis became the most popular name in the entertainment business and earned the nickname the King of Rock and Roll. After Elvis became popular, African American performers like Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, and Little Richard found success. And white performers like Buddy Holly and Jerry Lee Lewis also became popular. Rock and roll music was a shock to America. Teenagers rebelled against the big band music their parents liked. They thought rock and roll was great for dancing, which scared their parents. Dance parties were popular, and American teens watched Dick Clark's American Bandstand to keep up with the latest dance and fashion styles. Frank Sinatra, a famous singer from the 40s, said that rock and roll was tasteless and brutal. Some people thought it was immoral and banned it from radio stations and schools. But teens loved it, and when Elvis appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, the show's ratings went up. Rock and roll became the soundtrack of America's baby boomers and went on to conquer the world. Let's take a minute to mention some of the people who didn't enjoy the 1950s. In the 1950s, most Americans were doing well, but not everyone was benefiting. Older Americans and African Americans were still living in poverty. Older people were struggling because they'd lost their money during the Great Depression and couldn't find work again because of their age. Some blue-collar workers were also having a hard time, with 30% of those working in factories still living in poverty. The gap between black and white became huge. In 1947, 60% of black families were poor, while only 23% of white families were. In 1968, it was better, but still not good. 23% of black families were poor, compared to only 9% of white families. After World War II, 12 million soldiers came home and needed jobs, but there weren't enough jobs to go around. There were also strikes that made things harder. Sometimes these strikes were made worse because black people had taken jobs during the war, and white soldiers were angry about it. Women who'd been working during the war, remember the Rosie the Riveters, were also pushed out of their jobs so men could take them. In 1952, Ralph Ellison penned Invisible Man, which pinpointed American indifference to the plight of African Americans. "I am an invisible man," he wrote. "I'm invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me." Ellison earned the National Book Award for his work, and Invisible Man continues to be ranked among the greatest novels in American literature. As you already know from our last unit, the civil rights movement began at the end of the 1950s, so we can see how the challenges African Americans faced at the time, when most Americans were doing well, led to action. African Americans were not the only minorities to suffer hardship in the 1950s. Hispanic Americans languished in American urban barrios, and the Eisenhower administration responded with a program derisively called Operation Wetback, designed to deport millions of Mexican Americans. But of course, as you already know, the response was a fight for rights and representation in the form of the Chicano movement. Poverty on Native American reservations increased with an Eisenhower policy designed to end federal support for tribes. Incentives such as relocation assistance and job placement were offered to Native Americans who were willing to move off the reservations and into the cities. Unfortunately, the government was good at moving people, but did not do well at helping them get jobs, leading to the growth of Native American ghettos in many Western cities. And this eventually led to the formation of groups like AIM and the fight for Native American rights in the coming years. Other groups, people like Jews, Italians, and Asians, also had a hard time fitting in and finding their place in America during this time. During the 1950s, TV and movies showed ideal American families that were white, Christian, and living in the suburbs. But some people disagreed with this idea and shared their opinions through art, writing, and action. The Beatniks were a group of people who became famous for speaking out against the 1950s ideal. They wore black turtlenecks, sweaters, jeans, sandals, or Converse shoes. They wore berets and dark glasses. They frequented coffee houses. They invented the idea of being cool. Although they were mostly white, beatniks loved African American culture and celebrated it by going to jazz clubs. They wanted to live differently than their parents' generation, so they listened to a new kind of jazz called bebop. This music was based on small groups instead of big orchestras and focused on improvisation. Talented musicians like John Coltrane and Dizzy Gillespie were pioneers of bebop. The beatniks didn't like the popular music of the time, like rock and roll, because they thought it was too mainstream and too commercialized. They weren't trying to change mainstream American culture because they thought it was too corrupt. Instead, they thought the only way to find true meaning in life was to separate themselves completely from mainstream society. Beatnik communities formed in cities like New York, San Francisco, Venice, and Los Angeles, and the French Quarter in New Orleans. Writers were the main force behind the Beat generation, and the one who first explained what it meant to be beat and cool was Allen Ginsberg. He wrote a poem called Howl that was published in 1956. It criticized how everyone was trying to be the same. The poem talked about using drugs and homosexuality, which was against the law in most states at that time. Because of the poem's controversial content, politicians tried to stop it from being printed, and the bookstore owner who first sold it was arrested. However, the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, said the poem was important literature, and a judge ruled that it was okay to publish it, which set an example for free speech. Jack Kerouac was another writer who defined the Beat generation. He wrote a book called On the Road in 1957, which tells the story of a young beatnik who goes on a journey to find the true meaning of life. Kerouac believed that people could only live a meaningful life if they completely cut themselves off from mainstream society. Other writers of the Beat generation had their own criticisms of mainstream culture. John Kenneth Galbraith argued that happiness and education were more important than making money. Louis Mumford disliked the new suburbs and their artificial nature, and he felt that they gave like a childlike view of reality. Singers even joined it, mocking suburban houses in their songs. C. Wright Mills feared that companies making things for the American military during the arms race had too much power and could hurt American democracy. J.D. Salinger wrote about teenagers growing up in the false happiness of the suburbs in his book, The Catcher in the Rye. American painters also fought against conformity during the 1950s. Edward Hooper, a well-known artist, challenged the happy images shown on television by painting pictures of an America that was filled with isolation and loneliness. In New York City, a group of painters created a new style of art called abstract expressionism, which is considered the most important artistic movement to come from America. Painters like William de Kooning, Hans Hofmann, Mark Rothko, and Jackson Pollock wanted to show their subconscious feelings and their unhappiness with post-war life through creative paintings. They believed that actually painting was almost as important as the artwork itself. Jackson Pollock became famous for his style of action painting, where he poured, dripped, and splattered the paint onto the canvas. Rothko used large rectangles in his canvas to show basic human emotions. In the 1950s, movie theaters showed mainly westerns and romantic films, but a few movies stood out. The Wild One starred Marlon Brando as a biker gang leader who caused trouble in a small town. The film scared adults, but fascinated young people who copied Brando's style. Black Boar Jungle, which came out in 1955, was about juvenile delinquency in a city high school. It used rock and roll soundtrack and was banned in some areas because it had a multiracial cast and showed violence. Rebel Without a Cause, which also came out in 1955, was a controversial movie about teenage delinquency in a rich suburb. It earned 3 Academy Award nominations and made James Dean famous. It's interesting to note that many of the people who were speaking out against conformity and society's focus on money and success in the 1950s were white, middle-class Americans who were benefiting the most from the country's economic growth. On the other hand, people who had struggled and sacrificed during World War II, such as lower-class and blue-collar workers, as well as minorities, were not as interested in the counterculture movement. They were finally experiencing some prosperity and saw no reason not to enjoy it. Even though the beatniks and critics would inspire a larger movement in the following decade, most middle-class families were content with the suburban lifestyle and the idealized families they saw on TV. And that brings us to the end of our lesson about life in the 1950s. Let's conclude with a review of the big ideas. Most Americans have happy memories of the 1950s. During the 50s, the economy was doing well, and for the first time ever, most Americans could afford houses, cars, and new inventions like televisions. Highways were built, people bought cars, there was plenty of food, and there were new advances in medicine. Dwight Eisenhower was president, and he kept the government from spending too much while also not reducing popular programs like Social Security. The GI Bill helped veterans of World War II buy houses and attend college. For the first time, both became common. Those same veterans came home and started families. Their children, the baby boomers, are one of the nation's largest generations ever. To house these families, suburbs were built. Cities grew, shopping malls and fast food restaurants sprung up. It was a time of huge population growth in California. People in the 1950s became more religious. More Americans went to church. However, the Supreme Court also limited the influence of religion in schools, banning school prayer, for example. In the 1950s, there was tremendous pressure for people to live up to an ideal. Families were supposed to have married parents, with a dad who worked and a mom who stayed home to raise polite children. They were supposed to have a house in the suburbs and a car. Televisions were new and promoted this idealized version of family. Sitcoms were popular. Westerns were also popular, in which good guys could always triumph over evil. Rock and roll was new in the 1950s. Although based on African American traditions like rhythm and blues, it was first popularized by Elvis Presley. Not everyone enjoyed the prosperity of the 1950s. The elderly, women, African Americans, and other minorities did not benefit from the GI Bill. The Beatniks rejected the conformity of the 1950s. Centered in San Francisco and New York City, they preferred a new form of jazz called bebop and criticized mainstream culture. The Beat Generation created some of the best literature of the 1950s. New styles of art were invented by painters who rejected conformity, and some movies of the 50s also showed that not everything in America was perfect. When we come back, we'll be talking about the 1960s, when the children who grew up in those perfect suburbs of the 50s became teenagers and rejected everything their parents had dreamed up. It's time for the arrival of the hippies. I'll see you then.
Come on, people now, smile on your brother, everybody get together.